This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Rise of the Empire, an expansion for Star Wars Rebellion. Star Wars Rebellion Rise of the Empire was released in 2017 by Fantasy Flight Games and designed by Corey Konieczka. This game supports up to 4 players and takes from 3 to 4 hours to play. As I said earlier, this is an expansion for Star Wars Rebellion, so if you have not learned how to play that game, there are some episodes on Harsh Rules that will teach you how. In this tutorial, we will learn how to use the expansion's new game components and rules additions with the base game. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Rise of the Empire has new versions of cards that replace the base game's cards. Let's take a look at them before moving on to setup. Integrating the Rise of the Empire expansion into the Star Wars Rebellion base game requires several card replacements. Let's walk through each type before we get into the revised setup for the game. The first card replacement is for the game's mission cards. In this section, you will be replacing 3 cards. 1 Sabotage card, and 2 Construct Super Star Destroyer card. On the left, I'm showing the original cards from the base game, and on the right is the cards to replace them from the expansion. At first glance, the cards look identical, which confused me as well when I opened up the expansion, but you can tell the difference of the base game cards versus the expansion cards by looking for the tiny Death Star icon printed on each card. This icon helps you identify which cards belong to which set. Now, upon closer inspection, you can see that the text is different between cards. The cards from the expansion have been modified to address new rules. For example, Sabotage talks about the effects in relation to the new shield bunker unit, and the revised Construct Super Star Destroyer mission card gives you a production bonus for assigning 2 leaders to a mission. Next, let's talk about the action card replacements. There are 2. The first is Son of Skywalker, and the second is Good Intel. Like before, I've placed the base game versions on the left and the expansion versions on the right. Once again, these cards can be differentiated from each other by the tiny Death Star icon. For the new expansion version of these cards, Son of Skywalker now references a new expansion card called Critical Rescue. And Good Intel is rewritten to work with the expansion's Advanced Tactic cards. Finally, the Tactics cards from the base game are completely replaced by the larger sized Advanced Tactic cards. These cards are not only divided between space and ground types like in the base game, but also specific card sets for the Rebels and the Imperials. We will discuss how these cards are used in the Cinematic Combat section a little later in the tutorial. Now that we've got the old cards replaced with the new cards, let's talk about setting up the play area with the expansion components. The expansion comes with an extension to each faction sheet that lists the new units and their stats. Place this extension beneath the faction sheet as shown on the screen. The remainder of the play area looks the same, but there are some changes to the deck setup. Also, a quick note, with the addition of new leaders from the expansion, each faction, whether playing with 1 player or teams of 2 players, are limited to a maximum of 8 leaders. Next, we're going to discuss the revised mission deck setup for the expansion, which is much more complex than the base game. Mission decks are still categorized into 3 stacks: the Rebel mission deck, the Imperial mission deck, and the Imperial Project deck. The composition of these decks are different depending on the type of expansion game you and your friends want to play. First, I'm going to show you the recommended deck composition for your first few games with the expansion. When creating the mission decks for the Imperial or Rebel factions, include all cards with a leader icon. That's from the base game and the expansion. Also include all cards with the Vader icon. Those are from the expansion only. Finally, include the 4 starting mission cards with the return arrow at the bottom. Remember to change out the Sabotage card with the revised version from the expansion. The Imperial Project deck includes all cards from the base game and the expansion with the star icon in the lower right-hand corner. The only exception here is to remember to replace the 2 Construct Super Star Destroyer cards with the expansion versions. Now let's look at the more advanced deck builds once you're comfortable playing with the expansion. Now let's talk about building mission decks for advanced games. Setting up the project deck remains the same as we just talked about regardless. There are 2 types of builds. The deck configuration for both factions is basically the same, so let's just focus on the Rebel mission deck versions. On the left is the setup for mission cards with no Vader icon. On the right is the setup for mission cards with the Vader icon. The rules refer to these versions as the base game card build and the expansion card build, but that's not exactly correct. Both deck builds use all the mission cards with the leader icon and the 4 starting cards. The remaining cards to add to the deck should either have a Vader icon or no Vader icon. What makes this confusing is there are cards in the expansion with no Vader icon. For example, like I've shown here, Subversion has 1 card with the Vader icon and 1 card without. The instructions just say to use the cards from the base game, but that's not true. You actually literally use all the cards from both the expansion and the base game with no Vader icons, which means you do include cards from the expansion. And obviously all cards with the Vader icon are exclusively from the expansion. I know, I sound a little grumpy, but the rule sheet was kind of maddening. And for a while, I thought my expansion set had misprinted cards, since I had duplicates with and without the Vader icon. So if you notice the same thing, that's what the deal is. Basically, you're going to have a mission deck with mostly base game cards or mostly expansion cards. That's the bottom line. Now to decide which deck build to use, when setting up the game, the Rebel player and the Imperial player each choose any 1 card from their mission decks and place them face down. Players then simultaneously reveal their cards. Each player that revealed a card that has a Darth Vader icon on it will use the Rise of the Empire set, and if they didn't get an icon, they'll use the base game set. This creates some variation in the gameplay. While we're discussing the play area setup, let's look at some new action cards that add attachment rings to leaders in the game. The expansion provides 2 action cards that bring new leader attachment rings to the game. First, let's talk about the Bounty Ring. This ring is attached with the post-bounty action card when a leader fails a mission. When the bounty ring is attached, if that leader is then captured, then the rebels lose 1 reputation. Next up is the K2SO ring. This ring is attached immediately when the He Means Well action card is drawn, and that ring is attached to any rebel leader that does not have a ring. With the K2SO ring attached, this leader gains an additional minor Spec Ops skill and a minor Intel skill. And those are the 2 new rings from the expansion. Now that each faction's play area is ready, let's discuss changes to setting up the board area. Once again, we're back to the game board. Before we get started with differences in the unit setup, let's discuss changes to how to set up the objective deck. The objective card deck requires a little more care when setting up. First, divide the cards into their 3 Roman numeral stacks for 1, 2, and 3. Remember to also include the new objective cards from the expansion. First, shuffle the 1 cards into a deck and draw 5 cards. Next, locate the 2 Death Star Plans objective cards from the 2 and 3 card sets. These cards will always be included with the 2 deck and the 3 deck. Next, shuffle the remaining 2 and 3 cards into their own decks and draw 4 cards from each of these decks. You can now place all the remaining objective cards back in the game box. Next, shuffle the selected cards into their own individual decks. Then stack the 3 decks on top of each other, with the 3 on the bottom, the 2 in the middle, and the 1 on top. Now the objective deck is fully built for the expansion and ready for the game board. Setup with the expansion is mostly the same as before, except with new units and additional setup for the Imperial player. Let's quickly run through the board setup again, integrating the expansion units and the new rules. Let's begin with the new Imperial setup requirements. First, take a Death Star under construction unit, 4 TIE Fighter units, and a Stormtrooper unit. The Imperial player must select one remote system to place this first batch of units. I've marked the available options on the screen. The Imperial player also receives a completed Death Star unit that they place on the production queue in position 3. Now let's look again at the system selection process with the new units. When playing with the expansion, players can decide if they want to use the starting units from the base game or the expansion. In the following setup recap, I'm using the units from the expansion so you can see what that looks like. Basically, the Imperial faction begins the game with a set number of units and 5 systems along with the galactic capital of Coruscant. The 5 Imperial starting systems are divided into 2 subjugated systems and 3 systems with loyalty to the Empire. The Rebels also begin with their own set of starting units, and 3 systems that are loyal to the Rebellion, plus 1 system with the secret Rebel base. The systems are selected randomly, but first remove the remote system that the Imperial player just chose. Then shuffle the probe deck again and you're ready to start selecting systems. Then, one at a time, draw a probe card from the deck and place it face up on the table. The emblem in the lower left-hand corner indicates which side of the conflict that system is sympathetic to. The first 2 systems with an Imperial emblem will be subjugated systems. The next 3 systems with the Imperial emblem after that will be loyal to the Empire. Every time a system with the Rebel emblem is drawn, that system is loyal to the Rebel Alliance. However, once you've drawn 3 systems loyal to the Rebels, all other Rebel systems are ignored. Once you've drawn enough cards to fulfill the quotas for the Imperials and the Rebels, take the remaining probe cards and reshuffle the deck. Next, the Rebel faction player will draw 1 card, keeping the system secret, and this becomes the secret Rebel base. Now that each side knows their systems, they can place their units. Each faction can place their units wherever they want on their systems with a few limitations. The Imperial player can place units in any of their systems with loyalty or under subjugation. Remember, it's the systems you just drew and Coruscant. However, they must place at least 1 Stormtrooper unit in each of these systems. The Imperial player can also place units in the remote system they just selected with the unfinished Death Star. The Rebels can place units in the secret Rebel base and either one of the systems loyal to the Rebellion that they drew, or a neutral system. In other words, a system on the board without a loyalty marker. Therefore, the Rebel Alliance may have up to 3 of their starting systems without defensive units, all 3 drawn systems without defenses if they choose a neutral system, or 2 systems with loyalty and no defenses if they select one of the drawn starting systems. This adds an additional layer of strategy for the Rebel faction to deploy their forces. Now that we've covered the differences in setting up the board and gameplay areas, let's talk about how the expansion changes gameplay. The Rise of the Empire expansion makes a number of changes with the introduction of new leaders. And while the 4 main leader skills are still applicable, you'll notice that the new leaders also have miniature icons as well. These are known as minor skills. Minor skills allow the expansion leaders to attempt to complete missions beyond their normal skill ability with the green dice. Another quick note while we're looking at leaders again, in the expansion, the numbers in the bottom corners of the leader standee no longer pertain to drawing tactics cards. In this expansion, these numbers now correspond to the number of dice that a leader can reroll in each respective theater. We will cover off on this more in our review of the expansion's new cinematic combat mechanics. But before that, let's talk about how minor skills work. Missions can be classified into two types: missions that can be attempted and missions that are automatically resolved. These mission types are identified by keywords in the mission card text. If the mission states it can be resolved, then the game effects are automatically implemented at the appropriate game phase. If the mission states it can be attempted, then it is treated just like the resolve mission unless the other faction opposes the mission. In my games, for missions, I always give the rebels the red dice and the Imperials the black dice. As you can see, Jyn Erso is attempting to complete a reconnaissance mission. She has one intelligence skill icon, and the mission requires 2 intelligence skill icons. However, this isn't a problem for Jyn because she has 2 minor skills in intelligence that she can use to attempt the mission. Each minor skill icon counts towards the eligibility to completing missions. Therefore, Jyn could actually attempt an Intelligence 3 mission. The same stats are applicable for Director Krennic, who is opposing this mission. Therefore, Jyn would receive 1 red die for her full intelligence icon and 2 green dice for her 2 minor intelligence skill icons. Director Krennic has the same skills and will receive the same number of these dice as well. Ultimately, the total score from rolling the dice will determine if the mission is successful or not. The difference between the red and black dice and the green dice is that the sides on the green dice are mostly blank, with only 2 sides having the direct hit icon. Trying to roll the direct hit symbol is a 1 in 3 chance, which reflects the minor skill ability. Therefore, while minor skills are useful for attempting more difficult missions, rolling the required symbols is much harder. And that's how you use green dice in the new expansion for missions. Next, let's talk about how the expansion updates the combat system to the cinematic combat system. Let's begin by discussing how the dice mechanics have changed with the introduction of the green dice. The green dice act as a middle ground between the black light attack dice and the red heavy attack dice. Each green die has only 2 direct hit markers and the remainder of the sides are blank. Therefore, it is harder to score a hit, but every hit will impact a unit with black health or red health, essentially every unit in the game. Now, only units from the expansion can use green dice, and that allows them to operate at this medium level. The next change regarding the dice mechanics is regarding the ability for leaders to now use their tactical abilities to re-roll dice. Therefore, stronger military-type leaders can turn the tide of a battle by allowing them to re-roll a specific number of dice tied to their ground or space tactical ability. Finally, the tactic symbol usage in cinematic combat has been changed. It no longer allows you to draw cards from the tactic deck. Now, a tactic symbol can be spent to remove 1 damage marker from a unit. However, the damage must be removed from a unit whose health matches the color of the die. Next, let's talk how the tactics cards have been re-implemented into the expansion as the advanced tactic cards. The Rise of the Empire expansion replaces the smaller tactics cards with the larger and more varied advanced tactic cards. But how do they work? Well, with advanced tactic cards, each faction begins the game with all of their cards rather than drawing them one at a time. These cards are not shuffled, they're essentially in the player's hand, and they can peruse them for any card they choose to play in the appropriate theater. Essentially, space cards can only be played in space battles and ground cards can only be played in ground battles. The etiquette for playing these advanced tactic cards is before a round of combat, be it in the space or ground theater, each player places their chosen card face down on the table in front of them. Next, each player simultaneously turns their cards face up. Then, starting with the current player, each chooses a section on their advanced tactics card and resolves the effect. Then the round of combat begins as normal. The anatomy of all cards is basically the same. Each card has two gameplay functions that split the bottom half of the card. The first section is the unit bonus tactic, which will always have a unit icon displayed. If that player has that particular unit in the battle, they can play the card for this bonus effect. Otherwise, a faction can play the card for the second generic tactic, which is similar to the bonus tactic with a lesser effect. These advanced tactic cards add an additional layer of strategy, as players must decide which cards to use for general and unit bonus effects. The great thing about advanced tactic cards is you can use the whole deck to set up your strategy, whereas the tactic cards from the base game were random. This expansion also introduces the target system with 3 Rebel objective cards and 1 Imperial mission card. An objective card with a target is easily identifiable by the dash in the upper left-hand corner. The Imperial mission card is called Secure the Plans. Each of these cards has an associated triangular target marker with matching artwork. The Raid Outpost objective card comes with 2 markers. With the objective cards, a target marker is placed in a specific system, and if the conditions are met, then the Rebel player scores reputation points. When the Imperials successfully complete the Secure the Plans mission, this nullifies the Rebels' ability to play the Death Star Plans objective card until the marker is removed. In all instances, a marker is removed if the system is solely occupied by the appropriate faction's ground forces. Let's discuss 2 new units in the expansion that have additional rules: the Interdictor and the Shield Bunker. One of the special abilities of the Interdictor is that it prevents Rebel retreat. To allow Rebel retreat from a battle, the Interdictor unit must be removed. The Shield Bunker, as we saw in Return of the Jedi, provides Death Star protection. Therefore, if the Rebel faction wants to destroy a Death Star, either an unfinished Death Star through normal combat, or a finished Death Star with the Death Star plans, they must first remove the Shield Bunker. The Shield Bunker also benefits from easy deployment, and may be deployed at any location with 1 trooper, but that location cannot contain Rebel units, and the loyalty does not matter. Shield Bunkers can also be used for local reinforcement. This requires the Shield Bunker be placed at a remote system without any Rebel units. With the Shield Bunker in place, the Imperial faction may then deploy units to these remote systems as if they were loyal. Keep these rules in mind as you play games with these new units. Hopefully you now have a better idea how to integrate the new rules and components for Rise of the Empire, an expansion for Star Wars Rebellion by Fantasy Flight Games. Questions about this game, requests for future Harsh Rules game tutorials, and constructive feedback are all greatly appreciated. Drop a line in the comments section. To be the first notified when this episode and any Harsh Rules episode is placed online, please subscribe to this channel. Until then, I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.